Snoop Dogg thought this flight would be smooth sailing, just another trip in first class. But when a hostile captain singled him out with shocking accusations, the tension skyrocketed, leaving everyone in disbelief. What happened next would change everything. Before we dive deeper into this gripping story, comment below where you're watching from today, and if you're rooting for justice in this tale, don't forget to subscribe. Snoop Dogg stepped onto the gleaming airplane aisle, adjusting his sunglasses as he took in the cabin around him. The first-class section was as close to luxury as you could get on a commercial flight, with spacious leather seats with ample legroom, adjustable lighting that bathed the cabin in a soft golden glow, and the faint hum of the engines, providing a soothing white noise. This wasn't a private jet, but it was as close as one could get without chartering their own plane. Snoop was used to luxury, of course, but this trip felt special. It was the first vacation he had taken in months, a well-deserved break after what felt like an endless grind. Between back-to-back studio sessions, live performances, and public appearances, Snoop had barely had a moment to himself. Now, finally, he was on his way to the Maldives, a dream destination he had been looking forward to for ages. As he sank into his plush first-class seat, Snoop let out a contented sigh. He removed his hat and tilted his seat back slightly, already feeling the weight of his responsibilities lifting off his shoulders. He reached for his phone, the screen lighting up to show his carefully curated playlist. With a swipe and a tap, his favorite beats filled his noise-canceling headphones. "Excuse me, Mr. Broaddus," a soft, polite voice interrupted his moment. He glanced up to see a flight attendant standing beside him with a warm smile. She held out a glass of freshly squeezed orange juice on a small silver tray. "Here you go, sir," she said cheerfully, addressing him by his real name, Calvin Broaddus. "Thank you, sweetheart," Snoop replied smoothly, flashing his signature charm as he took the glass. He raised it in a mock toast, a sly smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "Y'all know how to treat a brother, right?" The flight attendant chuckled softly and nodded. "Let me know if there's anything else you need during the flight, Mr. Broaddus." "You got it," Snoop said, raising the glass slightly again before taking a sip. The hum of the engines grew slightly louder as the plane began taxiing to the runway. Snoop glanced out the window, watching the sprawling airport slowly disappear from view as the aircraft prepared for takeoff. Around him, the other passengers in first class, well-dressed businessmen, couples, and affluent travelers, seemed content with their own distractions. Some were already reclining their seats and pulling out blankets, while others tapped away on laptops or scrolled through movies on their in-flight screens. For Snoop, the anonymity was a blessing. It wasn't often he could sit in a space without someone pointing a camera in his face or whispering his name behind his back. Here, among the quiet hum of the engines and the muted sounds of a first-class cabin, he felt almost invisible, something he hadn't experienced in years. As the plane's wheels left the tarmac, Snoop felt the familiar thrill of ascent. He closed his eyes for a moment, letting the sensation wash over him. The city below shrank into a patchwork of lights, and soon the vast sky stretched endlessly in all directions. With the plane climbing steadily, Snoop opened his tablet, pulling up a blank screen and a stylus. Even on vacation, creativity was never far from his mind. The hum of the engines, the faint vibrations of the aircraft, and the peaceful atmosphere made for the perfect backdrop to jot down ideas for a new track. Rhymes, melodies, and concepts flowed easily as he began sketching out thoughts. Hours passed. The flight attendants moved quietly through the cabin, offering meals, drinks, and pillows to the passengers. Snoop gratefully accepted a plate of roasted chicken and steamed vegetables, enjoying the surprisingly good food. After eating, he adjusted his seat into a recline and removed his shoes, wiggling his toes against the soft carpet beneath him. It felt good to relax. Outside the window, the day had turned to night. The soft, ambient lights of the cabin dimmed to match the quiet stillness that had settled over the passengers. Some were already asleep, wrapped in blankets and leaning against their headrests. Snoop put his headphones back on, switching to a mellow instrumental track. He closed his eyes, letting the music lull him into a light, peaceful doze. Suddenly, the soft hum of the cabin was interrupted by the crackling of the intercom. A confident voice filled the space. Bookmark. Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. We've successfully reached cruising altitude at 35,000 feet and are currently flying over international waters. The weather ahead is clear, and we are on schedule to arrive at our destination in just under 8 hours. Please let our crew know if you need anything to make your flight more comfortable. Thank you for choosing us. The announcement was brief and professional, nothing out of the ordinary. Snoop cracked one eye open as he stretched his arms lazily, appreciating the smooth flight so far. For the first time in months, he felt a sense of true calm. He adjusted his seat slightly and let out a contented sigh, preparing to drift off again. That's when he noticed it. The sound of footsteps, soft but deliberate, echoed faintly through the cabin. At first he ignored it, assuming it was just one of the flight attendants making their rounds. But as the steps grew louder and closer, Snoop became aware that they had stopped right near his seat. He opened his eyes fully this time, looking up to see a tall man standing in the aisle. It was the captain. The man was in his late 40s, his uniform immaculate, with epaulets on his shoulders that marked his rank. He had neatly combed hair and a clean-shaven face, but his expression wasn't what Snoop expected. The captain's features were tight, his lips pressed into a thin line, and his gaze seemed to linger on Snoop a moment too long. "Enjoying the flight, sir?" the captain asked, his tone polite but laced with something else, something sharper. Snoop pulled down his headphones and tilted his head slightly. "Yeah, man. Everything's cool. Appreciate y'all running a smooth operation." The captain didn't smile. He simply stared at Snoop for another beat, his arms crossed tightly against his chest. "We aim to ensure that every passenger here belongs," the man said, his words deliberate. Snoop raised an eyebrow, his calm demeanor starting to falter. "What's that supposed to mean?" The captain shrugged. "Just checking. That's all." With that, he turned on his heel and strode back toward the cockpit, leaving Snoop sitting there with a growing sense of unease. "What the hell was that?" Snoop muttered under his breath. He glanced around to see if anyone else had noticed the strange interaction, but most of the passengers seemed lost in their own worlds. Still, the mood in the cabin felt different now, heavier somehow. Snoop adjusted his sunglasses and leaned back in his seat, trying to shake off the strange encounter. But deep down, a small voice nagged at him. Something about the captain's tone, his words, none of it sat right. As the plane hummed steadily through the night sky, Snoop couldn't help but feel that the peace he had been savoring was about to shatter. Snoop Dogg shifted in his seat, trying to settle back into his earlier calm, but the captain's strange demeanor lingered in his mind. He wasn't the type to let things get to him easily. Over the years, Snoop had encountered all kinds of people, fans, skeptics, critics, and even haters, but something about this felt different. It wasn't the usual curiosity or awe he was used to. This was colder, sharper, like being under scrutiny for something he hadn't done. "Man, what's his problem?" Snoop muttered to himself, shaking his head slightly. He pulled his headphones back over his ears and turned up the music, letting the bass-heavy beat wash over him. Music had always been his escape. It was his sanctuary when life got noisy, and now was no exception. Still, no matter how loud he turned the volume, he couldn't shake the unease in his chest. Minutes turned into an hour. The cabin remained dim and hushed, the passengers around him either dozing off or buried in their in-flight entertainment. Occasionally, a flight attendant would move quietly through the aisle, adjusting blankets or offering water to passengers. Everything on the surface appeared normal, but Snoop couldn't help but feel a shift in the atmosphere, a change he couldn't quite put his finger on. He leaned over slightly, glancing at the rows of seats behind him. Most passengers were too absorbed in their own activities to pay him any mind, but he noticed a few sideways glances, subtle, quick, but definitely there. Were they looking at him because they recognized him? Or was there something else? Snoop wasn't sure, but it added to the nagging feeling of being out of place. He sighed and turned his attention back to the in-flight screen in front of him. A movie played silently, but he barely registered what was happening. His mind was elsewhere, still replaying that brief, uncomfortable exchange with the captain. Suddenly, the calm was interrupted by the crackling sound of the intercom. The captain's voice boomed through the cabin, his tone professional, but with an edge that wasn't there before. "Mr. Broaddus, please remain seated. I will be speaking with you shortly." Heads turned as passengers exchanged confused glances. Snoop sat up straighter, his brow furrowing as he processed the announcement. "What now?" he muttered under his breath, pulling his headphones down. The words echoed in his head. "I will be speaking with you shortly." What could this man possibly want now? A flight attendant appeared near the cockpit door and moved quickly down the aisle toward Snoop's seat. Her expression was strained, like she was trying to appear calm but was anything but. She stopped a few feet away, folding her hands nervously in front of her. "Mr. Broaddus," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. "The captain would like to speak with you. He'll be here shortly." Snoop raised an eyebrow, his patience wearing thin. "For what? I ain't done nothing." I don't know, sir," she stammered, looking genuinely uncomfortable. "I'm just relaying the message." Snoop sighed and leaned back in his seat, folding his arms across his chest. "Fine. Tell him I'm right here." The flight attendant nodded quickly and hurried back toward the front of the plane. Snoop's eyes followed her as she disappeared behind the cockpit door. A sense of dread bubbled in his stomach. This wasn't normal. This wasn't just curiosity or professionalism. This was something else entirely. Moments later, the captain emerged once again, his tall figure casting a shadow down the aisle as he made his way toward Snoop. This time, 2 flight attendants trailed behind him, their faces tight with unease. The captain stopped directly in front of Snoop's seat, his posture stiff and imposing, his eyes cold. "Mr. Broaddus," the captain began, his voice sharp and clipped. "I have a few questions regarding your presence on this flight." Snoop stared at him, stunned. "What? You heard me," the captain said, crossing his arms. "I need you to explain who you are and why you're here." "Bookmark?" Snoop felt his jaw tighten, a familiar frustration simmering beneath the surface. He had dealt with prejudice and suspicion before, but this was different. It was blatant, unprovoked, and completely out of line. "Man, I already told you, I paid for this seat, booked it fair and square." "Everything's legit," Snoop said, his voice calm but edged with disbelief. The captain's expression didn't waver. Instead, he smirked faintly, his lips curling in a way that made Snoop's blood boil. "You'll forgive me if I don't just take your word for it." Snoop clenched his fists, doing his best to keep his composure. "You don't need to take my word for it. You got the paperwork, right? Check it. I'm supposed to be here." Around them, passengers were now openly watching the exchange. Some stared with wide eyes, while others whispered quietly to one another. Snoop could feel their eyes on him, their curiosity and confusion only adding to the tension. "Look," Snoop continued, his voice firm but measured, "I don't know what your problem is, but you're making a thing out of nothing. You got my name on the manifest. I paid for this flight. Let it go." But the captain didn't move. His smirk disappeared, replaced by a scowl that darkened his features. "You don't belong here," he said quietly, his voice dripping with disdain. "I don't know what kind of game you're playing, but I'm not buying it." Snoop blinked, momentarily stunned by the audacity of the man's words. "Don't belong? What's that supposed to mean?" "You know exactly what it means," the captain snapped, his tone rising slightly. Snoop shook his head slowly, disbelief flashing across his face. He couldn't believe what he was hearing. This wasn't just a misunderstanding or overzealous professionalism. This was prejudice, clear and ugly. "You're tripping, man," Snoop said finally, his voice low but steady. "I'm sitting here minding my own business, and you're acting like I don't deserve this seat." The captain took a step closer, his face mere inches from Snoop's. "You don't," he said coldly. "People like you don't belong here." The words hit Snoop like a slap. For a moment he was speechless, his mind racing to process what had just been said. The cabin fell deathly silent, the other passengers frozen in shock at the captain's blatant hostility. "You don't know me, man," Snoop said finally, his voice calm but laced with anger. "You don't know who I am or what I've done. But I'll tell you one thing. You're out of line." The captain didn't reply. Instead, he straightened up, his expression smug and unrepentant. "We'll see about that," he said sharply before turning on his heel and marching back toward the cockpit. Snoop remained seated, his heart pounding in his chest as the other passengers watched him silently. He could feel the weight of their stares, the judgment, the uncertainty, and maybe even a hint of sympathy, but no one said a word. He sank back into his seat, his hands trembling slightly as he stared out the window. The view outside was serene, nothing but an endless stretch of stars and sky, but inside, Snoop's world felt anything but peaceful. For the first time in a long time, Snoop Dogg felt truly out of place. The cabin had fallen into a strange, uneasy silence. The other passengers, though not speaking directly to Snoop Dogg, continued to steal glances his way. Some looked curious, others appeared uncomfortable, shifting in their seats as if trying to make themselves invisible. The interaction with the captain had cast a shadow over the first-class cabin, and Snoop could feel the tension lingering in the air like a bad taste. He leaned back in his seat, staring out at the darkness outside the window. The calm he'd felt at the start of the flight was gone, replaced by a swirling mix of disbelief, frustration, and anger. What the hell was that all about, he thought. His jaw tight. He had done nothing wrong, absolutely nothing, yet here he was being treated like some kind of intruder. Snoop exhaled slowly, his mind racing. The captain's words echoed in his ears. "You don't belong here." It wasn't the first time in his life someone had implied that, but hearing it now, on a flight he'd paid for, in a place where he was simply trying to enjoy a well-earned vacation, stung more than he wanted to admit. "Man, I'm too old for this," Snoop muttered to himself, shaking his head. He pulled his headphones back over his ears and hit play on his music, trying to drown out the noise in his head. But even the smoothest beats couldn't fully distract him from what had just happened. Minutes passed, maybe an hour. It was hard to tell. Just as Snoop was starting to think the incident might be behind him, the intercom crackled to life once again. The captain's voice boomed overhead, more curt and forceful this time. "Mr. Broaddus, remain in your seat. I will be speaking with you again shortly." Snoop's eyes snapped open, his brows furrowing in disbelief. What now? He sat up straighter, pulling the headphones off and tossing them onto the seat beside him. Around him, passengers shifted uncomfortably, murmuring among themselves. The tension, which had been simmering just below the surface, was now undeniable. Before Snoop could even process what was happening, the cockpit door opened, and the captain emerged once more. His posture was stiff and rigid, and his expression colder than before. He marched down the aisle with purpose, his polished shoes clacking against the floor as he closed the distance between himself and Snoop. Trailing nervously behind him were two flight attendants, their faces tight with discomfort. They exchanged worried glances, clearly caught in a situation they didn't want to be in. The captain stopped in front of Snoop's seat, towering over him like a judge passing a sentence. His arms were crossed, his jaw set, and his eyes held that same unshakable hostility. "Mr. Broaddus," the captain began, his voice sharp and loud enough for the entire cabin to hear. "I've received reports that you're behaving suspiciously." Snoop blinked, his patience hanging by a thread. "Reports? Suspicious?" he repeated, his voice calm but edged with incredulity. "Man, what are you even talking about? I've been sitting here minding my business." The captain smirked, though there was no humor in it. "Passengers have expressed concerns," he said vaguely, glancing around the cabin, as if looking for support, "and I take those concerns seriously." Snoop shook his head slowly, refusing to take the bait. "Ain't nobody said nothing, man. You're making this up. I assure you, I'm not," the captain snapped. "Now I need you to cooperate with me. Who are you really, and what are you doing here?" Snoop let out a humorless laugh, leaning forward slightly. "I already told you, I'm Snoop Dogg. I booked this flight like everyone else in here. You got the manifest, right? Check it." The captain's face darkened, his smirk vanishing. "You expect me to believe that someone like you," he said, his voice dripping with venom, "belongs in first class on my plane?" There it was. Blatant, unfiltered prejudice, served up for the entire cabin to witness. Snoop felt a fire spark in his chest, but he forced himself to stay calm. He had dealt with ignorance before, but something about this man, the audacity, the arrogance, was pushing him to his limit. "Someone like me?" Snoop echoed, his voice low and controlled. "What's that supposed to mean?" "You know exactly what it means," the captain shot back, leaning in slightly as if trying to intimidate him. "Troublemakers, criminals, thugs with money, people like you don't belong in places like this." The words hit Snoop like a punch to the gut. the entire cabin fell silent. Even the hum of the engine seemed quieter now. Passengers stared openly, their expressions ranging from shock to discomfort. Some looked like they wanted to say something, but no one did. It was as if they were frozen, unsure of how to react. Snoop clenched his fists, his knuckles turning white. Every part of him wanted to stand up, to get in the man's face and tell him exactly what he thought of him. But he knew better. He knew that reacting in anger would only give the captain exactly what he wanted. Instead, Snoop leaned back in his seat, his gaze steady and unblinking. "You don't know me, man," he said quietly, his voice firm but calm. "You don't know where I come from or what I've done. But let me tell you something, you're out of line." The captain's face twisted into a sneer. "We'll see about that," he muttered before turning sharply on his heel and stalking back toward the cockpit. The two flight attendants lingered for a moment, exchanging uncertain glances, before following him quickly. Snoop sat there, his hands still clenched in his lap, his heart pounding in his chest. He could feel the weight of the other passengers' stares, but he ignored them. He stared out the window, breathing slowly and deeply, trying to calm the storm that was building inside him. This ain't over, he thought, his jaw tight, not by a long shot. The cabin settled into an uneasy silence, but the damage had been done. Whispers rippled through the rows behind him, hushed voices exchanging snippets of what had just happened. Snoop could hear bits and pieces of their conversations. "What do you think that was about? Isn't that Snoop Dogg? Why's the captain treating him like that? Maybe he did something. I don't know." Snoop gritted his teeth, resisting the urge to turn around and snap at them. He knew how people were, quick to jump to conclusions, to assume the worst about someone they didn't understand. He had dealt with it his entire life, but that didn't make it any easier to swallow. A flight attendant passed by his seat a few minutes later, her eyes avoiding his as she hurried down the aisle. Snoop leaned back and closed his eyes, but sleep was out of the question now. His mind was racing, replaying the captain's words over and over again. "You don't belong here." It wasn't just about him, Snoop realized. This was bigger than that. How many times had someone like him, someone who looked like him, been treated this way? How many people had quietly swallowed their pride and let it slide simply because they didn't have the platform to fight back? Snoop clenched his jaw, a flicker of determination rising in his chest. He wouldn't let this go. Not this time. The cabin remained hushed, an uncomfortable quiet that felt almost suffocating. Snoop Dogg sat motionless in his seat, his gaze fixed on the endless night outside the window. The stars, faint and scattered, blinked back at him through the darkened sky. He tried to focus on their distant glow, to lose himself in their calm, but the tension bubbling in his chest wouldn't subside. The captain's words echoed over and over in his mind. "People like you don't belong here." The audacity, the prejudice. It wasn't just insulting, it was maddening. And worst of all, the captain had said it in front of everyone, an audience that, despite their silence, had felt complicit. Snoop could feel their eyes on him, their judgments, or perhaps their fear, and it made the insult cut that much deeper. He exhaled sharply and reached for his phone again. His hand hovered over the screen before he let it drop into his lap. There was no point in distracting himself. He knew something was coming. The captain wasn't finished with him. He could feel it. And sure enough, a few minutes later, the intercom crackled to life. "Ladies and gentlemen," the captain's voice boomed, this time devoid of its earlier professionalism. "Due to a safety concern, we will be making an unscheduled landing at the nearest airstrip. Please remain in your seats and follow crew instructions. Thank you." The words sent a ripple of confusion through the cabin. Passengers turned to one another, their whispers growing louder. "What safety concern?" someone asked, their voice cutting through the chatter. Snoop sat up straight, his instincts flaring. A safety concern? He knew exactly what this was. His eyes narrowed, and he muttered under his breath. "This ain't got nothing to do with safety." The flight attendants appeared in the aisle, moving briskly as they began checking seatbelts and instructing passengers to sit tight. One of them, an older woman with kind eyes, paused near Snoop's row, glancing at him nervously before quickly looking away. It was as though she knew something but couldn't say it. "Hey," Snoop said, raising a hand to get her attention. "What's really going on here?" The attendant hesitated, looking torn. "I'm sorry, sir," she said softly, "but I don't have that information." "You don't?" Snoop pressed, his tone skeptical. "Or you just can't tell me?" She opened her mouth as if to respond, but quickly stopped herself, glancing nervously toward the front of the cabin. "Please remain seated," she said instead, her voice faltering as she hurried off down the aisle. Snoop let out a dry laugh, shaking his head. "Man, this is some bull." The minutes ticked by painfully slowly as the plane began its descent. The hum of the engines changed pitch, and Snoop felt the aircraft tilting slightly downward. He looked out the window, trying to spot where they were landing, but there was nothing. No city lights, no signs of civilization, just darkness and faint outlines of trees stretching for miles. As the plane got closer to the ground, he finally saw it, a narrow airstrip, dimly lit and surrounded by dense forest. The runway seemed isolated, like it had been plucked out of nowhere and dropped in the middle of the wilderness. Snoop's unease deepened. "What kind of place is this?" he muttered. The landing was smooth, but the eerie silence in the cabin only grew heavier as the wheels touched down and the plane taxied to a stop. Passengers shifted in their seats, glancing around with growing confusion. Some whispered among themselves, their voices carrying a note of nervousness. The cabin door opened with a faint hiss, and the captain reappeared. This time, his expression was colder than ever, his posture rigid as he marched straight down the aisle towards Snoop's seat. "You," the captain barked, pointing a finger directly at Snoop. "Get your things. You're getting off this plane." Snoop stared at him, his brows furrowing. "What? You heard me," the captain snapped. "Get up. Now, bookmark. Go back." A stunned silence fell over the cabin as passengers turned to watch the scene unfold. Snoop remained seated, refusing to be intimidated. "Man, I paid for this flight," he said, his voice calm but firm. "I ain't going anywhere." The captain's face darkened further, and his voice rose. "I'm not going to ask you again. Either you get up and leave, or I'll have you removed." Snoop's patience had run out. He stood slowly, towering over the captain despite his calm demeanor. "You're way out of line," he said, his voice low and steady. "You got no right to treat me like this." The captain smirked faintly, his arrogance oozing through every word. "You're a danger to this flight," he said, his voice dripping with disdain. "And I'm not taking any chances." "A danger?" Snoop repeated, disbelief flashing across his face. "Man, the only danger here is you and that attitude." The captain didn't respond. Instead, he turned to the two flight attendants who had been standing nervously nearby. "Escort him off the plane," he ordered, his voice cold and final. The attendants looked visibly uncomfortable, but they hesitated only for a moment before stepping toward Snoop. "I'm sorry, sir," one of them said softly, her voice barely audible. "Please just come with us." Snoop looked around the cabin, his gaze meeting the eyes of the other passengers. Some of them looked shocked. Others avoided his gaze entirely, but not a single one spoke up. No one said a word in his defense. The silence said everything. Finally, Snoop sighed, shaking his head. "Fine," he muttered, grabbing his bag from the overhead compartment. "But y'all gonna regret this." The captain stepped aside as Snoop was led toward the open door. The air outside was thick and humid, carrying the faint scent of jungle vegetation. Snoop paused at the threshold, turning back to look at the captain one last time. "You think this is over?" Snoop said, his voice low but resolute. "It ain't." The captain sneered, his expression smug and unbothered. "Goodbye, Mr. Broadus." With that, Snoop stepped off the plane and onto the tarmac. The door slammed shut behind him with cold finality, and within moments the engines roared to life. He watched as the aircraft turned slowly, taxiing back down the runway before lifting into the night sky and disappearing into the darkness. Snoop stood there, clutching his bag, surrounded by nothing but silence and the faint sounds of wildlife from the dense jungle that loomed beyond the airstrip. The realization hit him like a punch to the gut. He had been abandoned, left in the middle of nowhere with no explanation, no way to contact anyone, and no idea where he even was. For the first time in years, Snoop Dogg felt truly powerless. Snoop Dogg stood frozen on the edge of the tarmac, his bag gripped tightly in his hand as the roar of the airplane engines faded into the distance. The cool metallic door that had slammed shut moments earlier now seemed like a portal to another world, one where people didn't leave you stranded in the middle of nowhere. But here he was, alone. The air was thick and humid, clinging to his skin like a wet blanket. Around him, the darkness of the jungle loomed, alive with strange sounds, distant rustles, chirps, and the low hum of unseen creatures. It was a far cry from the smooth luxury of first class, and for a brief moment, Snoop found himself wondering if he was in some kind of surreal dream. He adjusted the strap of his bag on his shoulder and took a deep breath. "Keep it together, man," he told himself. This wasn't the first time life had thrown him into the unexpected, and it wouldn't be the last. His eyes scanned the area, trying to get his bearings. The narrow airstrip stretched out before him, its surface cracked and littered with gravel. A small shed sat to one side, its weathered wood barely holding together. The faint glow of a single light bulb flickered weakly near the door, offering the only illumination in an otherwise pitch-black night. "Well," Snoop muttered under his breath, "this is some next-level bull." He turned toward the shed, hoping to find someone, anyone who could explain what was happening. His footsteps crunched against the gravel as he approached, the silence around him punctuated only by the distant calls of animals. Each sound set his nerves on edge. He wasn't afraid of much, but being stranded in an unfamiliar jungle with no clear way out, that was enough to make even him uneasy. When he reached the shed, Snoop pushed the creaking door open cautiously, half expecting someone to jump out. Instead, the interior was empty. Dust particles danced in the dim light, and cobwebs hung in the corners like old decorations. A few rusted tools were strewn across a rickety table, and an ancient-looking radio sat on a shelf, its knobs broken and covered in grime. Snoop ran a hand over his face, letting out a frustrated sigh. "Man, where the hell am I supposed to go?" He stepped back outside, staring into the endless jungle that surrounded the airstrip. The oppressive heat made the air feel heavy, and beads of sweat began to form on his brow. The realization of his predicament sank in. There were no phones, no cars, no people, nothing but him and the wilderness. He thought about the captain and the smug look on his face when he'd ordered Snoop off the plane. It made his blood boil. This wasn't just a misunderstanding. The man had gone out of his way to humiliate him, to paint him as a problem where there was none. And now, he had left him stranded out here like he was nothing. Snoop clenched his fists, his jaw tightening. "You're gonna regret this," he thought bitterly. But for now, anger wouldn't get him out of this situation. He needed to focus, to find a way back to civilization. Slinging his bag higher on his shoulder, Snoop started walking. He had no real direction, just a vague hope that maybe if he kept moving, he'd find a road, a village, something, anything. The gravel of the airstrip eventually gave way to dirt, and then to thick, uneven jungle ground. Tree roots jutted out like traps, and low-hanging branches swatted at his face as he pushed forward. The sounds of the jungle grew louder the deeper he went, bird calls, the rustle of leaves, and the occasional screech of something he couldn't identify. He swore under his breath as a mosquito buzzed near his ear, swatting it away with an irritated swipe of his hand. "Man, this ain't how my vacation was supposed to go," Snoop muttered. Time felt strange as he walked. It could have been minutes, or it could have been hours. He couldn't tell anymore. The oppressive heat wore him down, and his clothes were damp with sweat. His legs ached from stumbling over uneven terrain, and his throat felt dry, the humid air offering no relief. Finally, he stopped, leaning against the trunk of a massive tree to catch his breath. He pulled a water bottle from his bag and took a sip, the lukewarm liquid barely satisfying his thirst. "Okay," he said aloud to himself, his voice echoing faintly in the stillness. "Think, man, think." He was stranded, but he wasn't helpless. Snoop had been through tough situations before, and he knew how to stay calm under pressure. But there was no denying that this situation was different. Out here, there were no managers, no bodyguards, no fans to lean on, just him in the jungle. He thought about his family back home, his friends, his team. Did they know what had happened? Were they already trying to track him down? Or were they still assuming he was halfway to the Maldives, sipping cocktails on a beach? The thought of his loved ones gave him strength. "You ain't gonna let this beat you," he told himself. "You've come too far to let some racist captain get the best of you." Pushing off the tree, he continued forward, forcing his tired legs to move. The ground grew muddier the deeper he went, and the sound of water reached his ears, a faint, steady trickle. Following the sound, Snoop eventually stumbled upon a small stream cutting through the jungle. Relief washed over him as he crouched down by the water's edge, splashing some of the cool liquid onto his face before taking a cautious sip. It wasn't perfect, but it was better than nothing. As the sun began to set, the jungle transformed. The light filtering through the trees turned orange and gold, casting long shadows across the ground. But with the beauty came a new layer of unease. Night was falling, and the sounds of the jungle grew sharper, more menacing. Snoop knew he needed to find some kind of shelter before it got completely dark. Sleeping out in the open, surrounded by God knows what, wasn't an option he was willing to consider. He scanned the area until his eyes landed on a slight clearing near the stream. It wasn't much, but it was flat and relatively clear of undergrowth. Dropping his bag onto the ground, he began gathering fallen branches and leaves, creating a makeshift spot where he could sit and rest for a while. As he settled onto the ground, back against the trunk of a tree, Snoop let out a long breath. He could feel the exhaustion pulling at him, but his mind refused to rest. Instead, it replayed the events of the day over and over: boarding the flight, the captain's hostility, and the humiliation of being thrown off. His fists clenched involuntarily. This wasn't just about him. The captain's actions were part of something bigger, a prejudice that still ran deep, even when someone like Snoop had achieved everything society claimed to value. "They ain't gonna get away with this," he whispered to himself, his voice a low growl. Not this time. The sky grew darker, the stars slowly appearing through the gaps in the jungle canopy. The air was cooler now, but the sounds of the night were anything but calming. Snoop pulled his bag closer, his ears alert to every snap of a twig and rustle of leaves. Despite the exhaustion in his body, he forced himself to stay awake, his mind working through every possible plan. He didn't know how, but he was going to get out of this, and when he did, the world was going to know exactly what had happened. The jungle was alive with sound, a constant chorus of chirping insects, distant animal calls, and the rustling of leaves as nocturnal creatures moved unseen in the darkness. Snoop Dogg sat huddled in his makeshift clearing, his back pressed against the rough bark of a tree. His bag rested at his side, a poor substitute for a pillow. He shifted uncomfortably, the uneven ground poking at him through his clothes. Every instinct screamed at him to stay awake, to stay alert, but exhaustion weighed on him like a stone. Hours of walking, the humid heat, and the emotional toll of everything that had happened left him drained. Still, sleep wouldn't come. He stared up at the sky through the gaps in the thick canopy, the stars a faint glimmer in the vast darkness. Each sound around him made him tense. Every crack of a twig or sudden rustle jolted him back to full awareness. "This ain't the place for a city boy," he thought grimly, wiping sweat from his forehead. The jungle was indifferent to who you were, what you'd accomplished, or where you came from. Out here, he was just another man trying to survive. As the hours dragged on, his thoughts turned again to the captain. That man's words still burned in his mind. "You don't belong here." The venom in his voice, the smug satisfaction in his expression, it all replayed in Snoop's head on a loop. Snoop clenched his fists, anger flaring up again. This wasn't just about him anymore. The humiliation he'd endured, the blatant prejudice, it was something that so many people like him had faced time and time again. But he wasn't going to let this go. He was Snoop Dogg, and the world would hear about this. First thing first, he reminded himself. Gotta make it out of here. Hours passed, and the dark eventually gave way to a soft, pale light as dawn approached. The jungle came alive in a new way. Birds began to call out from the trees, their voices cutting through the stillness. The air, while still heavy with humidity, felt slightly cooler as the first rays of sunlight filtered through the canopy. Snoop pushed himself up from the ground, groaning as his stiff muscles protested. His back ached and his legs felt like lead. He rolled his shoulders, trying to shake off the discomfort, and took a swig from his half-empty water bottle. "Daylight," he muttered, squinting up at the sky. "That's a start." He had no real idea of where he was or which direction he needed to go, but sitting still wasn't an option. Slinging his bag over his shoulder, Snoop started walking again, following the stream that had been his only real landmark. If he was lucky, it would lead him somewhere, maybe a village, a road, or even just a clearer path through the jungle. The going was slow. The terrain was uneven, with roots snaking across the ground like traps waiting to trip him up. Branches clawed at his clothes, and the air grew hotter with every passing minute. Snoop kept moving, forcing himself to focus on each step. His mind wandered as he walked, thinking about his family, his friends, and the life he had worked so hard to build. He pictured his home, the familiar comfort of his own space, and the people who cared about him. They probably don't even know where I am right now, he thought bitterly. The realization stung. For all his fame, for all his influence, here he was, lost, abandoned, and utterly alone. After what felt like hours, Snoop noticed something up ahead, a break in the trees. His heart leaped in his chest as he picked up his pace, his legs burning with every step. As he pushed through the last of the underbrush, he stumbled into an open clearing. For a moment, he froze, blinking in disbelief. In the distance, nestled between the trees, was a cluster of small huts. Thin trails of smoke rose from their rooftops, and he could hear faint sounds, voices, laughter, and the distant rhythm of drums. It wasn't much, but it was civilization. Finally, Snoop breathed, relief washing over him. Bookmark, go back. Summoning the last of his strength, he started toward the village. His steps were uneven, his body screaming for rest, but he didn't stop. The closer he got, the clearer the sounds became. People talking, children laughing, the clinking of pots and pans. As he neared the outskirts of the village, a few figures emerged from one of the huts. They were locals, men and women dressed in simple, traditional clothing. Their expressions shifted from curiosity to shock as they took in the sight of Snoop stumbling toward them, his clothes dirty and sweat-streaked, his face lined with exhaustion. A young man stepped forward, his eyes wide. "Yo? Is that Snoop Dogg?" The words seemed to ripple through the small group like a shockwave. More villagers began to emerge, their faces a mix of awe and disbelief. Snoop stopped a few feet away, raising his hands in a gesture of peace. "Yeah, it's me," he said, his voice hoarse but steady. "I ain't here to cause no trouble. Just need a little help." For a moment there was silence. Then the young man grinned, his expression breaking into excitement. "It is Snoop Dogg! Yo, man, what are you doing here?" Snoop let out a tired laugh, shaking his head. "Long story, bro. Trust me, you wouldn't believe it if I told you." The villagers quickly sprang into action. One of the women brought him a jug of water, which Snoop accepted gratefully, drinking deep until his throat no longer felt like sandpaper. Another brought a small wooden stool and gestured for him to sit. "Man, y'all lifesavers," Snoop said as he lowered himself onto the seat, wincing slightly from his aching muscles. The villagers gathered around, their curiosity evident as they whispered among themselves. The young man who had recognized Snoop crouched down beside him, his grin still wide. "What happened, man? How'd you end up out here?" Snoop exhaled slowly, shaking his head. "Some racist captain threw me off a flight, left me out here like I was nothing." The young man's smile faded, replaced by a look of anger. "What? For real?" "For real," Snoop confirmed, his voice steady. "It's all good, though. I'll get out of here, and I'll make sure the world knows what happened." The villagers exchanged glances, their expressions hardening with shared indignation. The young man stood, turning to the others. "We're gonna help him," he said firmly. "We can't leave him like this." Snoop watched as the group nodded in agreement, their resolve clear. Despite everything he had been through, he felt a flicker of hope. These people, total strangers, were willing to help him without hesitation. One of the older men approached, placing a firm hand on Snoop's shoulder. "You're safe here," he said in broken English, his voice kind but strong. "We help you." Snoop nodded, gratitude swelling in his chest. "Thank you," he said quietly. "For real. Thank you." As the villagers began moving around him, gathering supplies and making plans, Snoop leaned back slightly, letting the weight on his shoulders ease for the first time since he had stepped off that plane. For the first time in hours, he didn't feel alone. Snoop Dogg sat on a wooden stool in the middle of the village, a bottle of fresh water cradled in his hand. The villagers moved around him with quiet purpose, gathering supplies, talking among themselves, and stealing occasional glances in his direction. Despite the chaos of his day, he felt an unexpected calm settle over him. There was something reassuring about the way these strangers had welcomed him, offering help without hesitation. The young man who had recognized him earlier, Jamal, as he had introduced himself, returned with a plate of food: roasted plantains, rice, and a small bowl of soup. Jamal knelt beside Snoop and handed him the plate with a grin. "You gotta eat, man," Jamal said, his tone light but firm. "You look like you've been through it." Snoop chuckled softly, accepting the food. "You ain't wrong, bro. I've had better days." Jamal sat cross-legged on the ground beside him, watching as Snoop ate. The food was simple but filling, each bite restoring a little of the energy he had burned walking through the jungle. Around them, children peeked out from behind huts, their wide eyes full of curiosity. A few of them giggled, whispering to each other as they pointed at Snoop. He smiled faintly, waving a hand to the kids. "Y'all acting like I'm an alien or something." Jamal laughed, shaking his head. "Man, you are Snoop Dogg. You don't just show up in a place like this. It's crazy." Snoop set the empty plate down beside him, his expression turning serious. "It's crazy how I ended up here, that's for sure." He paused for a moment before continuing. "That captain, he threw me off the plane, man, just tossed me out like I was trash. Why? Because of what I look like. That's it." Jamal's grin faded, his jaw tightening with anger. "That's messed up." "Yes," Snoop agreed quietly. He stared out at the villagers, who were now gathered in small groups, talking in low voices as they prepared supplies. "But you know what? It ain't the first time someone tried to knock me down. I've been fighting this kind of thing my whole life." Jamal nodded, his eyes hard with understanding. "It's like that for a lot of us. People see what they want to see. They think they know you just because of how you look." Snoop exhaled sharply, shaking his head. "The thing is, I wasn't even doing anything, man. I was sitting in my seat, minding my business, and this dude, this captain, decided I didn't belong. Like he's got the right to decide that." Jamal's voice grew firmer. "That's not right, man. Nobody deserves that." Snoop turned to look at Jamal, a faint smile tugging at the corner of his lips. "You're right about that, and I'm going to make sure the world hears about this." The villagers, meanwhile, were working quickly. Jamal had gathered a few of the younger men in the village to help figure out how to get Snoop back to safety. They spoke in hushed voices, pointing toward the jungle as they traced out a path to the nearest road. Snoop could see their determination, and it filled him with a sense of gratitude. A tall, older man approached. His face was weathered, his gray hair cropped short, and he carried himself with the quiet authority of someone who had seen much in life. He stopped in front of Snoop and Jamal, giving Snoop a nod of respect. "Jamal tells me you need help," the man said in broken but clear English. "I am Amani, the village leader." Snoop stood slowly, holding out his hand. "Much respect, Amani. I appreciate you helping me out." Amani shook his hand firmly, his gaze steady. "You are our guest now. We take care of you." Snoop nodded, feeling a swell of gratitude. "I owe y'all big for this. You didn't have to do all this." Amani placed a hand on Snoop's shoulder, his grip strong but reassuring. "Kindness is what makes us strong," he said simply. "If we do not help each other, who will?" Snoop fell silent for a moment, those words resonating deep within him. Despite everything he had been through, the humiliation, the anger, the frustration, here he was, surrounded by strangers who had no reason to help him other than the goodness in their hearts. Jamal grinned and clapped his hands together. "All right, here's the plan. There's a road not too far from here, about an hour's walk through the jungle. From there, we can find a truck or something to get you to the nearest town." Snoop raised an eyebrow, letting out a dry laugh. "Another walk through the jungle, huh? Y'all really testing me." Jamal laughed too, shaking his head. "Don't worry, man. You won't be on your own this time. We'll get you out of here." The villagers sprang into action, gathering supplies for the journey. Jamal and two other young men armed themselves with machetes to clear a path through the underbrush, while others packed water, food, and basic first aid into small bags. Before long, the group was ready to leave. A small crowd had gathered to see them off, the villagers waving and shouting words of encouragement as Snoop and his guides set out toward the jungle. "Be safe, Mr. Dog," one of the women called out, waving a brightly colored scarf in farewell. Snoop chuckled softly, shaking his head. "Man, y'all treat me better than half the places I've been." Jamal grinned, leading the way. "That's how we do it here." The jungle was no less oppressive than before, but this time Snoop wasn't alone. Jamal and the others moved confidently through the dense foliage, using their machetes to cut through vines and branches as they went. Snoop followed close behind, stepping carefully to avoid roots and muddy patches. As they walked, Jamal kept up a steady stream of conversation, asking Snoop about his music, his career, and what life was like back in the States. Snoop answered with a mix of humor and honesty, the conversation distracting him from the discomfort of the trek. "You ever think about coming back here someday?" Jamal asked after a while, glancing back over his shoulder. Snoop raised an eyebrow. "What, to the jungle?" "Nah, man," Jamal laughed. "To visit? To see us again? Bookmark?" Snoop smiled faintly, nodding. "Yeah, I might just do that. Y'all real ones out here." Jamal grinned, clearly pleased by the answer. "You got family here now. Anytime you need us, we got your back." After what felt like an eternity, the group finally broke through the last of the underbrush and stumbled onto a narrow dirt road. The sight of it was almost comical, just a dusty, uneven path cutting through the trees, but to Snoop it looked like salvation. "There it is," Jamal said, grinning as he wiped sweat from his brow. "Told you we'd make it." Snoop let out a relieved laugh, clapping Jamal on the back. "Y'all some lifesavers, man. For real." A few minutes later, the distant rumble of an engine caught their attention. Jamal waved his arms, flagging down an old beat-up truck that was bouncing its way down the road. The driver, a middle-aged man with a kind face, pulled over, his eyes widening when he saw Snoop. Is that Snoop Dogg?" the man asked, his voice tinged with disbelief. Snoop grinned, shaking his head. "Yeah, man, long story." The driver laughed and gestured for them to climb in. "Come on. Let's get you out of here." Snoop climbed into the back of the truck, leaning against the side as the engine roared to life. As the jungle began to disappear behind them, he felt a weight lift from his shoulders. He wasn't out of the woods yet, literally or figuratively, but he was on his way back. And when he got home, the world was going to hear the truth. The truck bounced along the uneven dirt road, each jolt sending tremors through Snoop Dogg's already aching body. He leaned back against the side of the truck bed, his bag resting on his lap as the wind whipped through his hair. The jungle, once a seemingly endless maze of greenery, was finally beginning to fade into the distance. In its place, small signs of civilization began to appear: fences, power lines, and the occasional patch of farmland. Snoop let out a long breath, the tension in his chest easing slightly for the first time since the ordeal began. He was still bruised, tired, and frustrated, but at least he wasn't alone anymore. Jamal sat across from him, grinning like this was just another adventure, while the older driver at the wheel hummed to himself, occasionally stealing glances at Snoop through the rearview mirror. "You know," Snoop said, raising his voice above the rattling of the truck, "y'all didn't have to do all this for me. I owe you big time." Jamal shook his head, leaning forward with his elbows on his knees. "Nah, man. Like I told you, you got family here now. You do the same for us, right?" Snoop smirked, his expression softening. "Damn straight." The truck swerved slightly to avoid a pothole, and Jamal laughed, gesturing at the bumpy road. "We'll get you to the nearest town soon. There's a little airport there. You'll be out of here in no time." Snoop nodded, grateful. "That's what I like to hear. Gotta get home, man. Got some things to take care of." Jamal's grin faded slightly, his expression turning serious. "You're gonna tell people what happened, right? About that pilot?" Snoop's jaw tightened as his thoughts turned back to the captain, the smug expression on his face, the venom in his words, and the humiliation of being thrown off that plane like he was nothing. He had kept his composure, but the anger still simmered deep inside. "Oh, I'm telling everybody," Snoop said firmly, his voice low and steady. "Ain't no way I'm letting that slide." Jamal nodded approvingly. "Good. People need to know." The truck rattled on for another hour before they finally rolled into a small, bustling town. It wasn't much, just a cluster of low buildings, a market, and a handful of shops lining the dusty streets. But to Snoop, it felt like a lifeline. People moved through the streets carrying bags of produce, chatting with neighbors, or selling goods from makeshift stalls. It was a far cry from the luxury he had been expecting on his vacation, but it was civilization. The driver pulled up outside a small, weathered building with a sign that read "Bus Station" in faded letters. Jamal jumped out first, waving to the driver in thanks before turning back to Snoop. "This is where we find you a ride to the airport," Jamal said confidently. Snoop climbed out of the truck, his legs stiff from the journey. "Man, you're like my personal tour guide out here," he joked, flashing Jamal a grin. Jamal laughed, leading the way inside. The station was small and crowded, with people milling about, waiting for buses that were parked haphazardly outside. The air smelled of diesel and fried food, and the walls were covered with faded posters and handwritten signs. Jamal approached the clerk behind the counter, speaking quickly in the local language. Snoop hung back, keeping his head low as curious onlookers began to take notice. A few people whispered to each other, their eyes widening as they realized who he was. Within minutes, Jamal returned, holding a slip of paper in his hand. "Got you a ride to the airport, bro. Leaves in 10 minutes. "Good looking out," Snoop said, clapping Jamal on the shoulder. As they made their way back outside, Snoop felt his phone buzz faintly in his pocket. He froze, hope sparking in his chest as he pulled it out and checked the screen. For the first time in hours, there were bars, just a single, flickering line of signal. But it was enough. Finally, Snoop muttered, quickly swiping through his contacts. He found his manager Kevin's name and hit the call button. The phone rang once, then twice before Kevin's voice exploded through the speaker. "Snoop? Man, where the hell have you been?" Relief washed over him at the sound of Kevin's voice. "Kev, listen. You won't believe what happened. Try me. The whole team's been going crazy. You disappeared, man. One minute you're on a flight, and the next, poof. What happened?" Snoop glanced around, lowering his voice. "Some racist-ass pilot threw me off the plane, bro. Straight up tossed me in the middle of nowhere. I have been trekking through the damn jungle just trying to get back." Kevin was silent for a beat, his disbelief palpable even through the phone. "You serious right now?" "As a heart attack," Snoop replied. "I'm in some little town now. About to catch a ride to the airport, but you need to get the word out. I want everybody to know what happened. Everybody." Kevin's tone shifted, his usual professionalism kicking in. "I got you. I'll get the team on it. We'll go public with this, let the world know what went down." "Good," Snoop said, his voice steady. "This ain't just about me, man. That pilot's gotta pay for what he did. Can't let him get away with it." "You know we got your back," Kevin said firmly. "You just get home safe. I'll handle the rest." Snoop ended the call and slipped his phone back into his pocket, his resolve stronger than ever. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. The bus to the airport was old and rattled with every bump in the road, but Snoop didn't care. As he sat by the window, watching the scenery blur past, his mind was already racing ahead to what came next. By the time he made it to the small airport, his plan was clear. He checked in, boarded a flight bound for the States, and leaned back in his seat as the plane took off. This time, there were no hostile captains, no sideways glances, and no whispers about whether he belonged. As the plane climbed higher into the sky, Snoop pulled out his phone and opened his social media apps. He tapped the record button, holding the phone up so that the camera captured his face, tired, bruised, but determined. "What's up, y'all?" "It's Snoop," he began, his voice steady despite the emotions roiling inside him. "I know y'all been wondering where I've been. Let me tell you what happened to me." Over the course of the next few minutes, he laid it all out, how the captain had singled him out, humiliated him, and thrown him off the plane for no reason other than his own prejudice. He described the jungle, the villagers who saved him, and the long journey back. "This ain't just about me," Snoop said, his tone turning serious. "It's about what's right. It's about standing up when people try to knock you down. That pilot thought he could get away with it, but nah, not today. We're gonna make sure this doesn't happen to nobody else." He ended the video and hit post, watching as it uploaded. Within minutes, notifications began flooding his phone, likes, shares, and comments pouring in faster than he could read them. Snoop leaned back in his seat, a faint smile on his lips. He wasn't home yet, but the fight had already begun. By the time Snoop Dogg's plane touched down in the United States, his phone was vibrating nonstop. His social media post had ignited a firestorm. Millions of people had seen the video, and the hashtag Justice for Snoop was trending globally. Messages of outrage and support flooded his notifications, with celebrities, activists, and fans rallying behind him. The injustice of his story struck a nerve. This wasn't just about Snoop, it was about something bigger. Bookmark, go. As he stepped off the plane, the weight of the situation hit him fully. Reporters crowded just outside the terminal, their cameras flashing and microphones thrust forward as they shouted questions. Snoop, what happened on the flight? Is it true you were abandoned in the jungle? What do you plan to do now? Snoop ignored the chaos, his expression calm but determined. Waiting just beyond the crowd was his manager, Kevin, who quickly ushered him into a black SUV. The door slammed shut, silencing the noise outside. You all right, man? Kevin asked, his voice a mix of concern and relief as he looked Snoop over. You look like you've been through it. Snoop let out a tired laugh, shaking his head. Kev, you don't even know. That whole trip was a nightmare. Well, it's about to get real, Kevin replied, his tone growing serious. The media's eating this up, and the public's on your side. People are mad, Snoop. Really mad. They should be, Snoop said firmly, staring out the window as the car pulled onto the highway. That captain disrespected me in front of everybody, and I ain't letting it slide. Kevin nodded, scrolling through his phone. I already got the legal team lined up. We're filing a lawsuit against the airline and the pilot. They're gonna have to answer for this. Good, Snoop replied, his voice cold and resolute. It's about time somebody put people like him in their place. The next few days were a whirlwind. News outlets across the country covered the story, replaying clips of Snoop's video and debating the broader implications of what had happened. Headlines screamed across every major platform. Rapper Snoop Dogg removed from first-class flight in shocking incident of racial discrimination. Justice for Snoop sparks nationwide outcry over airline bias. Snoop Dogg shares harrowing experience of being left stranded in jungle. On television, anchors spoke in somber tones as they dissected the incident. This isn't just about Snoop Dogg, one commentator explained during a panel discussion. This is about systemic prejudice that still exists in spaces where it shouldn't. First class, business class, it doesn't matter. For some people, no matter how successful you are, you'll never belong. Public pressure mounted quickly, and the airline scrambled to respond. Executives released a statement distancing themselves from the captain's actions and promising a full investigation. But it wasn't enough. The damage had been done. People wanted accountability. Meanwhile, Kevin and Snoop's legal team worked tirelessly behind the scenes, gathering evidence, building their case, and preparing for the inevitable court battle. Witnesses from the flight had already come forward, offering statements about what they had seen. He didn't do anything wrong, one passenger told a reporter during an interview. The captain singled him out for no reason. It was uncomfortable for everyone. Even a flight attendant, speaking anonymously, confirmed Snoop's version of events. The captain, he was out of line, she admitted, her voice trembling. I wanted to say something, but he was in charge. We all felt powerless. When the day of the trial finally arrived, the courthouse was packed. Reporters, activists, and curious onlookers filled every seat, and cameras lined the entrance, capturing every moment as Snoop stepped out of a sleek black SUV. He was dressed sharply in a tailored suit, his expression calm but resolute. This wasn't just about him. He was here to send a message. The captain, Richard Wallace, was already seated at the defendant's table. He looked pale, his posture stiff as he avoided eye contact with Snoop. His legal team huddled beside him, whispering nervously as the room buzzed with tension. Snoop's team, led by a renowned civil rights attorney named Lisa Carter, took their places with quiet confidence. Lisa was known for her sharp mind and commanding presence in the courtroom, and today she was ready to fight. The proceedings began with opening statements. Wallace's defense team tried to paint him as a professional who had acted out of concern for safety, but the argument fell flat. The prosecution, led by Lisa, was ready. This case is not about safety, Lisa declared, her voice ringing through the courtroom. It is about prejudice. It is about a man who used his authority to humiliate and endanger a passenger, my client, Mr. Broaddus, simply because of the color of his skin. The first witnesses were called to the stand. Passengers recounted what they had seen on the flight, how the captain had approached Snoop unprovoked, how his words and actions were laced with hostility, and how uncomfortable the entire ordeal had been. One businessman, a middle-aged man with glasses, testified, It was clear that the captain had already made up his mind about Mr. Broaddus. He didn't give him a chance to explain or prove anything. Next, the flight attendants were called to testify. At first, they hesitated, clearly torn between loyalty to their employer and the truth. But under Lisa's calm but firm questioning, they broke down. The captain? He was aggressive, one of the attendants admitted, her voice shaking. He wouldn't listen. When he ordered Mr. Broaddus off the plane, I knew it wasn't right, but I didn't know what to do. The turning point came when video footage was introduced as evidence. Security cameras at the airstrip had captured everything, the captain shoving Snoop, tossing his belongings onto the tarmac, and leaving him stranded as the plane took off. The courtroom fell silent as the footage played, the evidence undeniable. Snoop sat still, his expression calm as the video unfolded. The captain, on the other hand, grew visibly paler, his eyes darting nervously toward his lawyers. By the time closing arguments were delivered, the case was all but decided. Lisa stood before the jury, her voice strong and unwavering. "This case is not just about one man's experience," she said. "It is about accountability. It is about ensuring that no one else has to endure the humiliation and injustice that Mr. Broaddus faced. We must send a clear message. Prejudice has no place here. Not in our skies, not in our society." The jury deliberated for only a few hours before returning with their verdict. Guilty. Wallace was convicted of multiple charges, including unlawful discrimination and assault. The judge delivered a harsh sentence, revocation of his pilot's license, and a significant fine, along with community service. As the gavel struck, the room erupted into applause. Justice had been served. Snoop stood up slowly, turning to face the cameras as reporters swarmed him outside the courthouse. He raised a hand, calling for silence. "This ain't just my victory," he said, his voice steady. "This is a win for everybody who's ever been told they don't belong. We ain't letting this anymore. We're standing up, and we're fighting back." The crowd cheered, the moment going viral within minutes. Snoop had become more than a musician or celebrity. He was now a symbol of resilience, justice, and change. The sun cast its golden glow over the tarmac as Snoop Dogg stepped off the airplane, greeted by the familiar sights and sounds of Los Angeles. The soft hum of airport vehicles, the distant chatter of passengers, and the rush of wind all felt like music to his ears. This time, there were no hostile stares, no judgmental whispers, just the simple relief of being home. Kevin was waiting for him near the terminal, arms crossed and a wide grin stretching across his face as Snoop approached. "Man, look at you," Kevin said, shaking his head with a mix of pride and relief. "You did it, Snoop. You took him down." Snoop flashed a small smile, though the weight of the past few weeks still lingered in his eyes. "I didn't do it alone, Kev. Took a lot of real ones to make this happen. The team, the fans, everybody who stood up and said enough is enough." Kevin nodded, falling into step beside him as they walked toward the waiting car. "You turned this whole thing around, man. They tried to humiliate you, and you made it into a movement. Justice for Snoop isn't just a hashtag anymore. It's a wake-up call." "That's the point," Snoop replied, his voice calm but resolute. "This wasn't just about me. That pilot thought he could get away with it like nobody would care, like my voice didn't matter. Nah, man. I had to make sure the world knew what happened, and I had to make sure it doesn't happen to the next brother sitting in first class." As they reached the car, Kevin opened the door, letting Snoop slide into the back seat. The moment the door shut, the world outside grew quiet, and Snoop leaned his head back against the seat with a long exhale. The weight on his shoulders, though lighter now, still hadn't fully lifted. The days that followed were nothing short of a whirlwind. News outlets continued to cover the case, praising Snoop Dogg for standing up against injustice. His fight had ignited conversations far beyond his own experience, drawing attention to the issue of racial bias not just in air travel, but in society at large. Late-night talk shows ran segments about the trial, and activists held panels discussing the broader implications of the incident. Celebrities tweeted messages of support, sharing their own experiences with discrimination and lending their voices to the movement that had grown from Snoop's ordeal. Snoop, however, chose his moments carefully. He gave interviews that mattered, honest, pointed discussions where he laid out the facts clearly, refusing to let the message get diluted. He made it clear, that the fight wasn't over. "This ain't just about me," he said during one televised appearance. "This is about all of us. I was lucky. I had a platform to speak up. But how many people out there have gone through the same thing and never had a chance to be heard? That's who I'm fighting for." This is bigger than Snoop Dogg. Behind the scenes, the airline scrambled to repair its image. Public outrage had taken a massive toll on their reputation, and the CEO was quick to issue a formal apology. "We deeply regret the actions of the pilot involved in this incident," the statement read. "His behavior does not reflect our company's values, and we are implementing mandatory diversity and sensitivity training across all departments to ensure this never happens again." The apology came too late to change the damage, but for Snoop, it was a start. He knew real change wouldn't happen overnight, but this was a step in the right direction, a sign that the world was beginning to take notice. Meanwhile, Captain Wallace's fall from grace was swift and decisive. His pilot's license had been permanently revoked, and the court's ruling had ensured that he would be held accountable. No longer the untouchable figure of authority he had once presented himself as. Wallace faded into the background, a cautionary tale of what happens when prejudice is allowed to go unchecked. A week after the verdict, Snoop finally got a chance to do what he had originally planned: take a real vacation. The flight to the Maldives felt like a victory lap, every moment on the plane a stark contrast to what he had endured before. As he leaned back into his first-class seat, he was greeted by a smiling flight attendant who offered him a glass of champagne. "Welcome aboard, Mr. Broaddus," she said warmly. "We're honored to have you with us today. If there's anything you need, just let us know." Snoop accepted the glass with a grin, raising it slightly in a toast. "Appreciate that. Y'all already got me feeling like royalty up in here." The attendant laughed softly before moving on, and Snoop sat back, letting the calm of the moment wash over him. He pulled his sunglasses down over his eyes, a satisfied smile on his lips as the engines roared to life. This time, there were no sideways glances, no hostility, just respect. Hours later, as the plane descended toward the Maldives, the turquoise waters and pristine white sands stretched out below him like a vision. Snoop stared out the window, the beauty of it all making him pause. After everything he had been through, this moment of peace felt like a reward. When he stepped onto the tarmac, the warm tropical breeze greeted him like an old friend. Resort staff waited nearby with garlands of fresh flowers, their faces lit up with welcoming smiles. There were no cameras, no reporters, no chaos, just the calm he had been craving. A sleek golf cart carried him to his villa, an expansive beachfront property with a private pool and a direct path to the ocean. The sounds of the waves crashing gently against the shore filled the air, a soothing rhythm that made the weight of the past weeks seem to melt away. Snoop dropped his bag in the villa, kicked off his shoes, and stepped outside onto the soft sand. He walked slowly toward the water, the cool surf lapping at his feet as he stared out at the horizon. For the first time in what felt like forever, his mind was clear. Pulling his phone from his pocket, he recorded a short video for his followers. The sun glistened off the waves as he held up the camera, his voice calm and steady. "What's up, y'all?" he said, a faint smile on his lips. "Just touched down in paradise. Feels good to finally get a little peace after all the craziness. But listen, I want y'all to know something. What we did do back there? That was bigger than me. We made noise, we stood up, and we made sure the world was listening." He paused for a moment, letting the message sink in before continuing. "This fight ain't over. Not for me, not for you, not for anybody who's ever been told they don't belong. We keep pushing, we keep fighting, and we keep standing up for what's right. Stay strong, stay real, and remember, we ain't done yet." With that, he ended the recording and tucked the phone back into his pocket. The ocean stretched endlessly before him, the sun setting slowly on the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. Snoop smiled, the sound of the waves matching the steady rhythm of his heart. This was the peace he had fought for, and it was worth every moment. Turning back toward the villa, he took one last look at the ocean and nodded to himself. This was just the beginning. If this story moves you, we want to hear your thoughts. Was it inspiring? If you thought the story was good, comment with a 1. If you thought it was amazing, comment with a 2. And tell us about your own stories too. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss out on more meaningful stories coming soon. Share your thoughts about the story in the comments below.